Hello students, welcome to the video for the optional IA practice. If you take a look at the screen right on Canvas at the bottom of the day 2 items, you'll see the optional IA review lesson. You're going to need to open that and you'll see that there's this document. Please go ahead and do that. I'm going to ask you to read that to yourself and then pause this video, read that to yourself, and then resume when you're ready. I took the excerpt from a book that we are not using. It's from Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And so I give you some brief context at the top and then these 3 short paragraphs to read. So please pause the video here, read that excerpt, and then come back when you're done. Okay, so if you take a look at the next screen, let me go full screen real quick. The first thing I would like you to do is to review the general global issue categories. These are located in that resource that I've posted before, but it would help if you kind of read these here now again, right? Culture and identity, beliefs, values, and education, and then the descriptions of those things. So again, please pause the video here and then resume after you are finished reading. Okay, so after reviewing these general categories and after reading that passage, and without marking it up, in general, which of these global issue categories are explored within that excerpt? When you take a look at it, you'll see that the category of culture, identity, and community is present in the passage, right? Because it talks about things like class, race, gender, and the way those things are impacting the individual, Janie, as well as the impact they have on society. So that one would be something we could look into. Beliefs, values, and education. There are definitely ideas about how certain beliefs have shaped these communities and the way that they're acting in that courtroom. So you could check that off and you could make your focus that. Politics, power, and justice. Obviously, with a courtroom scene, this one would apply, especially when we start looking at this idea of the hierarchy of power within the community, who does and does not have it, questions of equality and inequality, human rights, and the idea of peace and conflict. And then if you take a look at these last 2, art, creativity, and the imagination, there isn't anything in that sample passage that kind of applies to that one. So that one we would just kind of leave alone. And then the science, technology, and the environment, the same thing is kind of true there, right? There's nothing about technology or science kind of impacting people. There is this idea of the relationship between humans and their environment, but I think it kind of makes more sense to explore that through, the idea or lens of community or through the lens of power, politics, and justice. But the choice is yours. I just think the first 3 apply more so than the last 2. Okay, so one approach to doing this would be to annotate and highlight things according to whichever general global issue category they fall under, right? That would look something like this. Like I would tell you to highlight anything that discusses, culture, identity, or community in yellow, right? So anything that comes up that's discussing, class, race, ethnicity, et cetera, and how it's impacting somebody, you would highlight that in yellow. And then you can kind of share that out with everybody. Then you would do the same thing in green for anything that you notice about belief structures or the values that the characters have. You would do the same thing in orange for anything that comes across having to do with equality and inequality, the hierarchy of power, etc. And as we mentioned earlier, that this one doesn't really apply, so you wouldn't actually highlight anything in red for this passage. But if you had another passage, that may actually be applicable. And the same thing for the magenta category, right? Like this doesn't apply to this passage, so you wouldn't have anything, but that's one way that you can do it. In the end, what you would end up with would be 5 different colors highlighted, right, in theory, in your passage. And then it would be up to you to kind of figure out, well, which one do I really want to focus on, right? Which color do I see more of, right? That way I have more to talk about that global issue category or something more specific within that global issue category. So after you select that global issue category to focus on, you would then just look at those lines that you highlighted in that color for the use of diction, imagery, details, language, or syntax. For the sake of brevity for this video, we will focus on the general category of culture, identity, and community today. Again, there are two other categories that you could use as well, but I'm just using this to kind of move things along for this demonstration. All right. So what I would like you to do, right, keeping this in mind, if you look at just that first paragraph, right, what devices are present in this paragraph that are relating to something having to do with culture, identity, and community, right, that are talking about class or race or ethnicity, etc. You can pause the video here and do that on your own, and I will reveal my thoughts in shortly. Okay, so at this point, right, just sharing what I found. So there's the general tone of the passage as far as diction is sad at first, right? Words like sorrow help convey that, or no need to punish her in jail by waiting, right? But then it shifts to a tone of curiousness, especially when they keep saying that there were plenty of people who came to look on this strangeness. Imagery that's present in these lines, right? There's the sight imagery of many people coming to observe Janie in the court, and that's used to show community interest. It also kind of highlights how nosy the community is. There's the detail about the short time that they deliberated for getting her court case, or for taking her to court, right, for the trial, but also, how short of a time it took for many observers to show up, which also kind of stresses how nosy the community is. Language that's present, within the passage. There's descriptive language mixed with storytelling through phrases like, to look on this strangeness, and who was it didn't know about the love between Tea Cake and Janie. The use of that rhetorical question also highlights how nosy the community is, right? The fact that these people had a relationship and everybody basically knew about it lets us know that these people talk a lot amongst themselves. And then as far as syntax is concerned, every single one of these sentences, right, this is all a series of fragments, and that's used to show familiarity between the narrator and the reader, right, or a casual kind of attitude between the narrator and the reader. Phrases like no need to punish, right, is a fragment that also kind of punctuates how obvious her innocence is to the sheriff and to the judge. And that phrase again, who was it didn't know, is a really wordy way and also kind of a lofty way of expressing how widespread their relationship is, right? And in some ways, it also communicates how great their love was. Before I move forward, as I look at these things, I want to start thinking about, all right, well, how are these all relating to culture, identity, and community, right? So first, there's definitely an issue in here about race, right? It's noted that there are plenty of white people coming to observe, etc. And then it also says, and all the Negroes from miles around. Notice that is kind of quickly stated, right? But through the use of a fragment, but then it doesn't actually come up again until we get to that last paragraph. Gender is also present in here, right? The fact that Janie is a woman is very important in this section. And both of those things we can see are having an impact on Janie as an individual, but also on the way that society treats her, or the way that society kind of functions in this case. So I'm going to use those as my focus for now. If you look at the next paragraph, I would ask you to do the same thing, right? You would pause the video here and then pull out, what examples of diction, imagery, details, language, and syntax do you see here? So please go ahead and do that now. Okay. So first, to start off, some diction. Words that depict whites as nosy include, the quote about had come to look at her too, and the fact that they use the word need, right? What need had they to leave their richness, right? So it's not simply a desire, like something they want to do. It's still stronger than that. It's a need. There's the image of the room full of white faces all staring at Janie, which also kind of conveys her alienation. And again, just as we mentioned in the previous slides, the amount of attention she's getting, right? And the fact that these people are nosy. There's a detail about the white people, and accentuates their lack of legitimate reason to be there, right? That they're really only there to gossip and because they're nosy. Excuse me. All of their details, from talking about how, where was it? I'm sorry. There was talking about the pink of their faces, right? They wore good clothes and had the pinky color that comes of good food, right? All those things are kind of designed to show you that they don't belong here, right? They've actually gone out of their way to see this kind of spectacle. There's also this detail about how Janie is thinking about the Undertaker. And those thoughts kind of help show that Janie doesn't prioritize herself or what these people think, right? She's focused on properly burying her husband. All of these things so far are still going back to these ideas about her gender, her race, and how that's impacting her as a person within this community and society, and how society is treating her. So that was diction, imagery, and details. Language in that same section is still that informal tone, right? The court people are going to, sit on this thing rather than like attend the trial, and they knew right well, right? These are kind of Southern familiar phrases that you would use to kind of show that you understand and you have a good relationship with the person who's listening. There's also rhetorical questions used in here. Like we said, what need had they to leave their richness to come look on Janie and her overalls, right? That rhetorical question reinforces the illegitimate whites in the room just to satisfy their curiosity, which also dehumanizes Janie. Then there's the syntax. Again, the fragments are still there to build familiarity, especially with those interjections like "oh," right? "Oh," and she hoped that Undertaker was fixing things, and yes, and there was Mr. Prescott. All those still kind of reinforce Janie's light treatment of the trial. There's also the repetition of the 12 men instead of saying the jury. And that syntax of repeating that phrase highlights Janie's ignorance in the situation, while also kind of pointing out the absurdity of relying on 12 strangers to determine her innocence. They don't know anything about her, and yet they're going to kind of be the ones who decide whether she goes free or not. It's also interesting that the only two words that are italicized in here are the words they and them in that sentence. What need had they to leave their richness to come look at her overhauls? But they didn't seem too mad. Jamie thought it would be nice if she could make them know how it was. And that those italicized words emphasize how Janie cares more about convincing her community than she does about the 12 people on the jury. And then that last paragraph is kind of interesting for several reasons. Please go ahead and pause the video here and do your own analysis of diction, imagery, details, language, and syntax, and I'll resume shortly. Okay. So looking at this, there's the general tone shifts actually in this part, from Janie's like cluelessness about what's going on to the negative and confrontational tone. And that's highlighted through phrases like, all against her, the comment about how a slap would beat her to death, pelting her with dirty thoughts, tongues cocked and loaded, and the word weapon. There's definitely a power dynamic that's being highlighted through the words like weak and allowed to use, right, in relation to the Black people standing in the back of the courtroom. There's the image of the site imagery of many Black people packed tightly in the back of the courthouse, which is a comment and related to the idea of how much power they have, right? An indication of how much power they have, which is not a lot. But also that idea, the image of slapping Janie, right? And how that's supposed to illustrate ridicule coming from her own community. Then there's the details. The detail about their standing in the back of the courtroom, again, highlights their position in the town's hierarchy. There's the language, there's figurative language in this section, whereas the other sections didn't use that. Here you have the simile of like a case of celery, which not only highlights their discomfort as they stand in the back of the room all squished together and the number of people, but it also frames the situation using farming terms that Janie would understand. There's the hyperbole of the slap that's used to accentuate the societal pressure. Then the metaphor of pelting her with dirty thoughts and rocks and with tongues and guns, right? Their cocked and loaded comment. That also reinforces how badly these people can hurt Janie metaphorically and emotionally with their judgment. And then the syntax. These are comparative. Sorry, this is a comparatively short paragraph dedicated to describing the Black audience in the room, which kind of mirrors the white people's lack of concern or attention towards them. Right, the white people got the longer paragraph, and the Black people in the room got a shorter one, which kind of like mirrors that power dynamic. And then there's the anaphora of they only in those last two sentences. They were there with their tongues cocked and loaded, the only real weapon left to weak folks, the only killing tool they are allowed to use in the presence of white folks, right? And that is in there twice, and it's repeated in those last two sentences to help kind of punctuate the lack of power that the Black people in the room have. So at this point, you have plenty of things that to use as support, that kind of help show how these things come up, how this issue comes up. So you would just need to kind of figure out, what does this passage suggest or say about these things, right? About the culture, identity, or community in this section. I'd like you to please pause the video here and do this on your own before moving on to the sample that I've provided. So please pause the video now. Okay, so the sample that I put together several of them, right? I just answered this question. This passage suggests that mixed race women are watched more closely by both their white and Black peers. This passage suggests that there is a problem with the amount of attention that some communities direct towards mixed race people. And this passage suggests that a person's race and gender will greatly influence other people's perception of their innocence or guilt. These are three things that I could use. I don't need to use all of them, but these are just three ways that I could answer that question, given what we discussed and what I was able to highlight in the 3 paragraphs. The next step would be to just add the list of the stylistic features or devices that you highlighted to the global issue, and that'll help you create your thesis, right? So you would start off with the author, right? Zora Neale Hurston uses, insert the devices that you're going to be using. I pointed out diction, imagery, details, language, and syntax on every slide, but not all of them would be used necessarily, not all of them would necessarily be used to prove this first one, right? So I would only use the bullet points that I made or my notes that apply to that one, right? I'd only use the notes that I used to apply to this one. But basically, that's how you construct your thesis statement. Please go ahead and do that on your own before advancing to the next part of the video. Okay. So I used that last sample, right, which actually does use all 5 of the elements. So my thesis statement would be, Zora Neale Hurston uses diction, imagery, details, language, and syntax to convey that a person's race and gender will greatly influence other people's perception of their innocence or guilt. The same issue is present in Joy Shin's diagram in the Japan Times, demonstrating that this is a problem all over the globe. Now, that second part, right, the same issue in Joy Shin's diagram, I made that part up. But I just wanted to use this as a way to demonstrate that this is how you would connect the two texts that you're using, the literary one that you are using that we read in class, but then the non-literary one that you select yourself. And this is one way that you can kind of show that, this issue doesn't happen just in the US, which is where Their Eyes Were Watching God was set, but also in other parts of the world. Several of you had also asked for some help with filling out your IA outline. So if you just follow with me here in the steps, the first thing you want to do is find that non-literary text that you want to use to accompany your excerpt that you chose and annotate it the same way that we did here today, right? Look for the words that are used in that. Analyze their diction, look for syntax, look at the imagery that's used and discuss what emotions you're supposed to feel because of those images, etc. After you've done that, I would suggest you fill in the script at the top, right, which gives the name of the text that you're using and the creators of the text. Use bullet points 1 and 2 to summarize or describe those two texts, right? So if I was using this, bullet point number 1, I would describe what happens in this passage and in the book in general, in very short terms. And then bullet point 2 would be that newspaper article from the Japan Times. And then next, you would want to state your thesis in the third bullet point, if you didn't already put it right after your script. And then arrange your notes from one text in chronological order for bullet points number 4, 5, and 6. And then for the other texts in bullet points number 7, 8, and 9. Right? And just do that in an order that makes sense for what you're working with, or that allows you to kind of use nicely flowing transitions to go back and forth between the two texts. You don't have to talk about all of text 1 and then move to all of text 2 if you don't want to. You can kind of jump back and forth. Just make sure you have transitions to let the listener know that that's what you're doing and that is intentional. And then the last thing that you'll need to put in is a concluding thought in that last bullet point, right? Again, you're trying to stress that this is a global issue, that it can't be a coincidence that the same problem is present in an American writer's text and, someone who's not living in America and the text that they created. And then that should help you fill out your IA outline. All right. So at this point, this ends the video. If you still have questions, I'm still available during office hours, etc. You could also be using the remaining time to check out to annotate your own passages, just like we did today with the sample one. You can work on your IA outline. There's also still the videos that go more in depth about how to analyze diction, imagery details, language, and syntax under day 1 of this week. And again, I'm available during office hours if you have further questions that this video did not answer. Thank you very much for watching.